Good morning, everybody. Sorry for my little lateness. Bonjour, collègues.
Good morning, colleagues.
Of the Standing Committee on Environment and Sustainable Development. This meeting is taking place in a hybrid format and is in public. We have witness testimony for the full 2 hours. For those in person, please follow the health and safety guidelines for using earpieces written on the cards found on your table. The committee is resuming its study on the effectiveness, potential improvements, and capability of Canada's 2030 emissions reduction plan. The following witnesses. From Clean Prosperity, Étienne Rainville, Vice-Président, Centre du Canada. From Pembina Institute, Janet McKenzie, Directrice Pétrole et Gaz. And from Keystone Agriculture Producers, Colin Hulby, Director General, who is video conference. Colleagues and witnesses, when you see this yellow card going up, it indicates you have 1 minute more to speak. And when you see this side, that means we stop speaking because time is up. Thank you. So I will start with opening remarks. Mr. Clerk, if you can just highlight the comments that we received from the Minister's office with respect to her visit.
Yes, sir. Environment Canada has written to the committee to advise that Minister Debrusin has not yet confirmed her availability, but officials from the department are available to appear before the committee on Monday, November 3, if it's the will of the committee to discuss the work of the committee, of the department. That's the update.
Thank you. All right, we will start with the witnesses' opening remarks. Monsieur Étienne Rainville, la parole est à vous.
Mr. Étienne Rainville, you have 5 minutes. You have the floor.
Mr. Chair and members of the committee for the invitation to present today. My name is Étienne Rainville, Vice President of Central Canada for Clean Prosperity. Clean Prosperity is a not-for-profit, nonpartisan Canadian climate policy organization that advocates for market-driven solutions to build the low-carbon economy and reduce emissions. The 2030 Emissions Reduction Plan, ERP, presented by the former federal government included dozens of measures aimed at reducing emissions. But for the purposes of this presentation, I'll focus on the merits of only one, industrial carbon pricing. Industrial carbon pricing is the single most significant policy detailed in the ERP. Industrial emissions account for 42% of Canadian emissions, and the single policy is projected to achieve as much as 50% of Canadian reductions by 2030. Further, it achieves that while being among the lowest economic costs to Canada, sensitive to trade-exposed sectors, creating minimal pass-through costs to consumers, and being widely supported by industry. The history of industrial pricing in Canada started in 2007 with Alberta's creation of the Specified Gas Emitter Regulation. Other provinces, such as British Columbia, Quebec, and Ontario, later followed suit and introduced their own systems. Industrial pricing went nationwide in 2018 with the passage of the Federal Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act. While industrial pricing systems vary by jurisdiction in Canada, most provinces operate output-based pricing systems. These systems work by establishing a performance benchmark for each facility and setting a stringency rate that prices a specific fraction of a given facility's emissions. That benchmark tightens every year, slowly escalating both the price and the fraction of emissions covered. Facilities that exceed the benchmark face a compliance cost, and those that outperform it are able to generate credits and sell those to those who have exceeded it. In this way, a market is created. The market is broadly technology and industry agnostic, and it works to identify and pursue the lowest cost decarbonization opportunities within a given jurisdiction. This allows the economy to target the lowest hanging fruit, prioritizing investments that can reduce emissions for, say, $50 a ton instead of $500. Non-pricing regulations, by contrast, are often more indiscriminate and less flexible, more economically burdensome, and often fail to distinguish between high-cost and low-cost emission reductions. While I expect most members of the committee are familiar with how the consumer carbon tax or fuel surcharge operated, there are 2 key differences I would highlight about industrial pricing that explains how it keeps costs low. The consumer carbon tax worked by charging a price on every ton of emissions. Industrial pricing systems work differently, by charging a price on only a fractions of emission, today roughly 20% in most jurisdictions. The consumer carbon tax charged the full carbon price on each ton, Output-based emissions pricing systems provide the option to pay by credits instead, with credits often trading at a discount to headline price, subject to supply and demand in a given market. So, what's the catch? The primary challenge with industrial pricing in Canada is long-term certainty. Initial emissions reductions can often be done through efficiency projects, but when those options are exhausted, facilities may consider deploying new technology like carbon capture, electrification, or fuel switching options. All of these are capital-intensive projects, and their economic case rests in part or in whole on generating revenue via credits in their output-based pricing systems. A lack of long-term certainty in the durability and the rules of the systems means that they aren't as investable as they should be. Without investment, you aren't deploying technology, and without technology, you aren't getting emissions reductions or the low-carbon growth that you're looking for. This is having real-world impacts. In our recent report, Market Force, we calculate that over $50 billion in projects across Canada need a stable carbon market to advance. This uncertainty also helps explain why the emissions reduction plan's modeling is falling short of real results. In our 2024 report, Missing Megatons, we found that uncertainty around carbon pricing could prevent Canada from achieving as much as 33 megatons of industrial emissions reductions per year by 2030, and the situation has only worsened since then. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Merci, Monsieur. Thank you, Mr. Rainville. I'll pass now the floor to Janet McKenzie for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and committee members. My name is Janetta McKenzie. I'm the director of the Oil and Gas Program at the Pembina Institute. I hold a PhD from the University of Waterloo, where I researched oil and gas regulatory development, and I've worked on regulatory compliance in the pipeline industry here in Alberta. In investigating the efficacy of Canada's emissions reduction plan, today I'd like to highlight two sectors whose emissions have changed dramatically over the last 20 years. I believe they tell a story of how strong, durable climate policies can work without damaging industrial competitiveness. First, Canada's electricity sector has achieved a massive reduction in greenhouse gases while growing its output. The sector has reduced 68 million tons, or 60% of its carbon emissions over the last 20 years, while increasing generation by 10%. On the other hand, the oil sands, the handful of companies in Alberta where bitumen is produced, have seen a 55 million ton increase in emissions since 2005. That's an increase of over 150%. And the difference is simple, and that's policy. The electricity sector responded to clear long-term climate policies. Ontario began its phase-out of coal-fired power in 2003, and building on that success, in 2012, Prime Minister Stephen Harper mandated a nationwide coal phase-out by 2061. Federal and provincial governments of different stripes built on that commitment, resulting in regulations that sought to eliminate coal emissions by 2030 nationally, all while giving provinces flexibility to meet that goal and industry the runway to invest in other forms of power generation. In Alberta, despite protestations that it couldn't be done, in 2024, the last coal-fired power plant went offline ahead of schedule, despite coal powering 60% of the grid just a decade before. Meanwhile, Alberta was initially flooded with billions of dollars of private investment in wind and solar projects, from which local governments collect millions of dollars annually in municipal tax revenues. In other words, coordinated coal regulations are a prime example of durable, predictable climate policy that companies can use to make long-term investment decisions. It's also a good reminder that climate policies don't only reduce emissions, they show the world that Canada is open for business for low-carbon investment. Globally, clean energy investment now outnumbers that in fossil fuels at a rate of 2 to 1, reinforcing Prime Minister Carney's statement that climate action is not simply a moral duty, but an economic imperative. Now let me turn to oil sands, which, in contrast to electricity generators, oil sands companies have not yet been subject to policy, either federal or provincial, that has effectively checked their overall pollution. Despite rhetoric about climate policies damaging the sector, oil sands production and emissions are at an all-time high. The oil and gas industry overall is responsible for almost 1/3 of Canada's emissions, and although only 1/20 of our GDP. For the oil sands and for all sectors, we need strong policy guided by clear target and predictable timelines that investors can have confidence in. Conversely, as we have seen south of the border, whiplashing policies are damaging to industry, suppliers, and workers. Industrial carbon pricing is Canada's best tool for driving innovation in high-emitting sectors like the oil sands. It has enjoyed the support of heavy industry, including oil and gas executives, for well over a decade because of how it slowly and predictably gets stronger, allowing them to plan out more and more investment in decarbonization over time. Unfortunately, the province of Alberta has recently taken backward steps that weaken its industrial price, despite the fact that complying with the current system costs oil sands firms just a few dollars on the barrel. So if what we want is a cleaner, future-proofed oil sands or anything approaching decarbonized barrels of oil, then strong industrial carbon pricing systems efficiently channel millions of dollars of private capital towards that goal. Finally, the fact that we are not yet on track to meet our 2030 climate targets does not mean that the emissions reduction plan has failed. Measures like industrial pricing, clean electricity regulations, and electric vehicle sales standards are long-term measures whose benefits will only be fully realized if they're given the time to do so. And much like preparing for a marathon, where every training run you do improves your fitness, every ton that we don't emit and every low-carbon investment that is made improves our climate competitiveness. But as the contrasting examples of electricity and the oil sands sectors show, we won't get there without long-lasting regulation and policies that investors can work with and depend on. Thank you again for having me today, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Mrs. McKenzie. And now for 5 minutes, Mr. Hornby, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, committee members. Appreciate the invitation to share some thoughts today on behalf of Manitoba farmers. My name is Colin Hornby, General Manager for Keystone Agricultural Producers, Manitoba's general farm organization representing the interests of all Manitoba farmers. Our membership includes over 6,000 direct paying individual farms and 20 commodity group members representing the entire sector. I want to start by saying that farmers care deeply about the environment. They live on the land, and in the many conversations that we've had throughout the years, one common theme persists. They want to leave the land the same or better than when they put that first seed in the ground. They depend on it every day for their livelihoods, their families, and their futures. Nobody has a greater interest in protecting our soil, our water, and our air than the people who work the land themselves. But what I hear again and again from farmers across the province is a growing sense of frustration and, frankly, a loss of trust in government environmental initiatives and programs. When targets and initiatives are undertaken, I can appreciate being aspirational and impactful. However, these must be grounded in the realities of how modern farming operations function. Let's take fertilizer emissions as an example. In 2020, ECCC released its Healthy Environment, Healthy Economy Plan, setting a target of reducing fertilizer emissions by 30% below 2020 levels by 2030. Now, this was described as a voluntary target, but farmers quickly realized the challenges with its feasibility. They understood that cutting emissions by 30% without cutting fertilizer use is simply not realistic, especially with today's crop yields and soil conditions. Farm groups, including ourselves and the CFA, made it clear that this target could hurt production, lower farm income, and weaken Canada's ability to compete on the world stage. Why did Ottawa not understand this? Canadian farmers are not opposed to efficiency or innovation. In fact, they've been world leaders in both. They've adopted precision agriculture, zero-till, cover crops, rotational grazing, and 4R nutrient management strategies that reduce waste and emissions. Agriculture has untapped potential. Compared to many other industries, agriculture can, in fact, remove emissions through carbon sequestration. Researchers have shown these effects. Farmers have created these effects. What farmers want are policies that work with them, not against them. They want policies grounded in science, not ideological assumptions about how agriculture works. And then there's the carbon tax. While we do appreciate greatly the fact this drastically unreasonable policy was eventually reversed, when it was implemented, farmers paid more to dry their grain, heat their barns, and transport their goods. These are not optional activities. They're the core of modern farming. Every extra dollar spent on fuel is a dollar taken away from investing in better equipment, new technology, employees, or next year's seed and inputs. I've personally seen the countless utility bills from our members over the years showing additional thousands of dollars spent per month to conduct these core business operations where there are no alternatives. CAP and other farm groups across the country were clear in our opposition, and yet our voices fell on deaf ears. The carbon tax put farmers at a competitive disadvantage, and this was one instance where the entire sector was unified and lobbied together against a single policy with one shared voice. Canadian farmers sell into global markets where they compete against producers in countries without these added costs. When input prices are already climbing for fertilizer, fuel, and feed, the extra layer of taxation made it even harder to stay competitive. And that's why, as I mentioned, there was such strong industry and multi-party support in Parliament for C234 in the previous Parliament, which proposed to exempt on-farm natural gas and propane used for essential processes like heating livestock barns and drying grain. Farmers were simply asking for fairness. We saw the efforts to stop that bill from being fully implemented, and it was disheartening for farm families across Canada. When government says it wants to partner with farmers, it needs to show that it's actually listening. Instead, what many producers see and feel is a pattern of Ottawa setting targets and timelines without meaningful consultation and without understanding how those decisions play out in the field. The result is a widening trust gap. This deepens the urban-rural and east-west divides that persist, especially in the prairies. Farmers want to do their part, but they're tired of feeling like they're being treated as if they're the problem. They are part of the climate solution, and that's the truth. Farmers are stewards of some of the most productive and sustainable farmland in the world, and they're already adopting practices without programs telling them to do so. What they need from Ottawa is predictability, competitiveness, and a genuine partnership based on respect for the expertise that they bring to the table. So, Chair, my message today is simple. Let's rebuild trust and listen to the people who feed our country and drive the economy. Economic growth must anchor any policies brought forward, including on the environmental file. You can't be green when you're farming in the red. So let's craft policies that strengthen, not weaken Canadian agriculture. And let's implement policies that help farmers stay competitive while continuing to care for the land they love with them at the table, not on it. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hornby, for your opening remarks. And maintenant, chacun des témoins dispose.
Each of the witnesses, we'll start with the Conservative Party for 6 minutes. Mr. Leslie, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Merci beaucoup. Merci.
Glad we were able to get an agricultural perspective added to this study. And I appreciated one of your lines that farmers need to be part of the solution, in fact, are part of the solution of the emissions reductions that we have seen in this country. I'd like to start with a specific policy, though. Now, you work on behalf of thousands of farmers in Manitoba. Have any of them ever indicated to you that they support the Liberals' electric vehicle mandate?
Thank you for the question. That's not a topic that I've heard brought up from our membership, no.
Now, you are a general farm organization, meaning you're not commodity specific, and you advocate for rural issues broadly. Do you think it is wise to force farm families living in rural Manitoba to purchase an electric vehicle where there are barely any charging stations and it's regularly below minus 30 in the wintertime?
I think what I would say to that is, in general, anytime I speak to a farmer, anything where you talk about forcing or requiring or prescripting a certain purchase or a certain activity or behavior is something that generally they would oppose. What we want is the ability for farmers to be able to choose what best suits their operation. It could be that perhaps somebody does choose to purchase an electric vehicle. That could be their choice. However, not everybody has the means, nor is it practical necessarily, depending on if you're, say, in Ethelbert, Manitoba. It may not be realistic for you where the infrastructure doesn't exist. So I think today that's not necessarily feasible for many producers.
Thank you. And during your opening remarks, you outlined some of the frustrations that many of us from the farming community have in terms of this Liberal government is the fact that it seems to be completely ignored. Farmers are an afterthought. You mentioned some of the laws that have been made without really any consultation. How frustrating is it for the farmers that you represent that Ottawa just goes and passes laws and regulations that drive up their cost of doing business without even consulting them?
I think what some of the sentiment that I've heard from our members is more than just about agricultural policy. There's a feeling between, and we've seen this throughout the country, is a bit of, I mentioned, a rural-urban divide, where there's a feeling that those who perhaps by no fault of their own, they're representing individuals and areas that are more urban. There's not necessarily an understanding of the realities of rural lifestyles and agricultural operations. So I think it is frustrating for sure for many to feel that way. And I don't personally believe there is ill intent. However, I think it's just the reality that needs to be talked about more and more. And then when we meet with members from urban areas, that's something we try to frame as how does agriculture impact them? And agriculture actually creates it's 1 in 8 or 1 in 7 jobs in Canada, regardless of where you are. If you look in Manitoba, down in St. Boniface, there's what we call a bacon corner where Maple Leaf has 3,000 jobs at a pork processing plant where we're the bacon capital of the world, essentially. So I think that's an urban area. So agriculture creates jobs and impacts members from everywhere in Canada.
And I hope you continue to share that message loud and proud, because we are a critical industry within this country. You mentioned the fertilizer use cap that was proposed back in 2020, and the farming community rightfully was completely outraged with, again, the lack of consultation, this idea that did not take into account or listen to the fact that we have adopted for our nutrient stewardship technologies, no or minimal till operations that have significantly reduced our emissions. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of those practices and the fact that we, as the farming community in Canada, have increased our output significantly while not increasing emissions, and where you think that could be going for Canadian farmers.
Yeah, so I think there's been a lot that's been done over the years, and I'm not an agrologist or an agronomist, so speaking to the specific numbers or processes isn't perhaps something I could do. But I do know that, for example, for our nutrient stewardship there in Manitoba, the model that we've adopted is a memorandum of understanding between industry, government, and producer groups like ourselves. So it's CAP, Fertilizer Canada, and the government of Manitoba. And this has gone back 20 years. And it's a shared commitment with farmers at the table, government at the table, and industry, producers of fertilizer. And we say, okay, here's a system for our nutrient stewardship, which encompasses many different strategies and components. And how do we work together to advance these principles and increase the number of acres that are using for our practices? We have seen a consistent increase over the years in that from this partnership. So I think that's one example where we could say this is a success. Is it's not prescriptive. What it is it's being collaborative. It's having government and industry and producers all together at the table saying, here's something that we all agree on, and here's something we can push forward together in our different respective ways.
Thank you. Now, in my view, and I assume you share this, that the world actually needs more Canadian agriculture. We should be darn proud of the strides that we have made in our industry to stabilize emissions while increasing our production significantly. The intensity has been increased. At a time when we see countries around the world that are devastating their forests, destroying landscapes to try to produce crops anywhere near the same quality and quantity that we do, how frustrating is it to see the federal Liberal government imposing penalties?
Thank you. I'm sorry, Mr. Leslie. Maintenant, pour 6 minutes, la parole est à vous, Monsieur Saint-Pierre.
Mr. Saint-Pierre, you have the floor for 6 minutes.
Attending here today. My question to you, Mrs. McKenzie. The Pembina Institute put together a report last year in 2024 called All Together Now, a Provincial Scorecard on Shared Responsibility to Reduce Greenhouse Gas Emissions in Canada. Firstly, can you provide a copy of that report to this committee? And then my question is that the report found a wide variation of performance across Canada's governments, and some provincial climate plans were more advanced than others. Can you share the performance of provinces, for example, Alberta, and the impact that certain provinces will have on Canada's nationally determined contributions?
Yes, of course, and we will send a copy of that report after this meeting. In 2024, the Pembina Institute worked with Simon Fraser University to identify 23 indicators that represent best practices in climate and energy policy, and we used those indicators to assess how Canada's federal and provincial governments were performing on climate and clean economy preparedness, and we awarded provinces green, yellow, and red ratings based on these indicators, based on their current policies and plans. And so some of our main findings were that 2 provinces are really leading, and that's British Columbia and Quebec, as well as the federal government, are really showing leadership with emissions reductions targets backed up by public monitoring processes with sector-specific measures like zero emissions vehicle incentives or methane reduction targets and strategies to protect populations from the worst effects of climate change. But two provinces are falling further behind, and even since last year have fallen even further behind. Alberta and Saskatchewan still don't have targets to reduce emissions by 2030, and the climate plans that they have released lack sufficient detail to be considered credible. They're also still actively opposing some federal climate measures like the phase out of coal in Saskatchewan or measures to tackle oil and gas emissions in Alberta, mostly on economic grounds, but while refusing to recognize that the economic impact of runaway climate change is quite significant, or of failing to seek out billions of dollars of low carbon aligned investment. And on Alberta specifically, I'd like to highlight it's a good example because while it has a climate plan that was released in 2023, there's very little in the way of actual policy levers that would facilitate achievement of that plan, which is why Alberta was awarded mostly red ratings. And it's quite notable as well that one of the province's only green ratings, which is that does the province have a carbon price on industrial emitters that meets the federal benchmark, is now likely to be red, given recent changes to TIER, especially the freezing of the headline price at $95 a ton, which Alberta says that it will retain for the foreseeable future, and which threatens to undermine investment in key low-carbon technologies, including carbon capture.
Great, thank you. And earlier this year, Pembina Institute also produced a report called Down But Not Out, which showed that the moratorium on renewables in Alberta caused the cancellation of 53 renewable energy projects. Firstly, can you provide a copy of that report to this committee, and what impact has such provincial action, such as the moratorium, had on Canada's 2030 targets?
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, in short, it makes meeting those 2030 targets quite a bit harder. Up until 2.5 years ago, Alberta was the destination of choice for renewable energy investment in Canada. For years, it led the country on new additions of wind and solar, generating billions of dollars investment and adding new low-cost generation options to the province's electricity grid. In August of 2023, the government of Alberta announced a sudden and surprise moratorium on approvals for all renewable projects. As you noted, the immediate effect of that was quite sharp. 53 projects pulled out essentially overnight. In February of 2024, the moratorium was formally lifted. However, there have since been a number of new policies and contemplated changes that do directly affect the renewable energy sector, which have undermined confidence in this once very booming industry. And so in August 2025, 2 years after the moratorium was announced, Pembina Institute analysis found that although the Alberta Electric System Operator Project development queue is now back at pre-moratorium levels, there's a concerning increase in cancellations, which suggests that while investors may be joining the project queue, many are then leaving before their project is approved or deciding not to put shovels in the ground even after they have approvals in hand. And indeed, we found that almost 11 gigawatts of wind, solar, and energy projects have been canceled since the start of the moratorium. And for reference, that's more than Alberta's average total power demand. And what's happening to Alberta's renewables market is decidedly quite contrary to global investment trends in renewables, suggesting that these policy choices by the government of Alberta are having a real direct effect on investor confidence.
Mrs. McKenzie. Quickly, I have 45 seconds with Mr. Rainville. You mentioned the missing megatons report. Can you provide a copy of that to this committee? And also, Clean Prosperity has done an exceptional leadership role in CCFDs, carbon contracts for differences. Can you quickly explain how CCFDs could get us to our 2030 or 2050 targets?
Thank you for your question. Absolutely happy to provide the report. On CCFDs, CCFDs are a mechanism, hard to elaborate in 1 minute, but they're a mechanism from the financial sector drawn from derivatives markets that are used in Canada now by the Canada Growth Fund in order to provide certainty around industrial pricing and the revenues associated with it.
Thank you very much. I'm really sorry, but maintenant la parole est à vous, Monsieur Bonnet, pour 6 minutes.
Mr. Bonnet, you now have the floor for 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. McKenzie, I think that you presented comments regarding the climate competitiveness strategy of the federal government. Is that the case? And if so, could you please table that document with the committee?
be happy to send our notes on the climate competitiveness strategy to the committee.
Merci. Donc,
Thank you. I'd like to check something. I think you talked about strengthening industrial carbon pricing. I'd like to hear more about that and the fact that Alberta refused to increase its industrial carbon rate. To your mind, is that a step backward, and is that equivalent to what we are seeing elsewhere in Canada with regard to carbon pricing?
Thank you for your question. Yes, industrial carbon pricing can really be the key policy in Canada that catalyzes private investment in clean technology deployment and projects that reduce emissions from heavy industries. The province of Alberta in the last year has made some key changes or signaled some key changes to its industrial carbon pricing system, including freezing the headline price for carbon at $95 a ton and investigating new additional compliance flexibility for firms, which do threaten to undermine what is already a weak credit market and opens the door to reducing the price signal for firms to invest in emissions reductions, including in carbon capture. Is this, to your question, is this aligned with what we're seeing across the country? It depends a little bit on the province. There are certainly issues with the strength of industrial carbon pricing across Canada, including in the federal output-based pricing system, and the upcoming federal review of both the federal output-based pricing system and then of equivalency agreements with the provinces in 2026 will be quite critical to ensure that those systems can be adjusted, can be made more stringent, and can get heavy industry on track with our 2030 emissions reductions targets and beyond, and really begin to see significant investment in heavy industry decarbonization.
merci.
Thank you. Earlier this month, you published a report entitled Not So Grand Bargain. In that report, it's true that you're evaluating that the carbon capture project, Pathways project, would not be sufficient to cancel out GHG emissions produced by a pipeline, 2 million barrels a day, I think. Mr. Carney and Alberta are considering that.
Yes, our report called A Not So Grand Bargain looked at 3 different scenarios of what oil sands emissions could look like in Canada. And under a scenario where we looked at what an additional new million-barrel-a-day pipeline and the emissions associated with that and the production that would need to be brought online to fill it, it would result in a scenario where even if the Pathways Alliance project was built in full, emissions from oil sands are still likely to be higher in 2035 than they are now. So not really aligned with decarbonized barrels or beginning to see emissions come down from this very, very high emitting sector. And we proposed in that report that the Pathways Alliance project on its own really represents a significant capital investment if it can be fully realized, but that a good, strong industrial carbon pricing system, in addition to the public support that's already on the table via the federal carbon capture investment tax credit and provincial grants, is sufficient to incentivize investment in that project.
And between the regulation and the capture strategy, what measures are the most effective in reducing GHGs in the oil and gas sector?
Yes, so beyond industrial carbon pricing, I'd also really like to highlight methane and the success that some parts of Canada have really had in reducing methane from oil and gas emissions, in particular British Columbia. Our research has found that British Columbia is the first jurisdiction in Canada to have met its 2025 oil and gas methane emissions reduction target. They did so 2 years ahead of schedule. And notably, BC achieved this while also growing natural gas production, highlighting the fact that stringent methane regulations do not undermine the industry's ability to operate. And in fact, methane abatement is some of the lowest cost and most readily available emissions reductions opportunities in the oil and gas sector. Also creates jobs, particularly in small and medium-sized businesses who work to develop world-leading methane abatement technology and also to assess leaks at oil and and gas sites and things like that. So it really is a success story that we've seen in British Columbia when it comes to reducing methane from oil and gas.
I think you also talked about taxonomy. Could you tell us what you would see when it comes to fighting climate change in the Canadian financial system? For example, should we require action plans that are aligned with the 1.5 degree rule, a taxonomy plan?
There's already been quite a bit of work done by the Sustainable Finance Action Council attached to developing a sustainable investment taxonomy in Canada. There are some really significant changes or sort of ways to prompt investment.
This is Janet, sorry, time is up. I'm sorry.
Sorry, no worries.
If you can reply to Mr. Bonnet in writing and forward your response to the clerk. Thank you. For 5 minutes, Mr. Bexty.
Thank you very much. Thank you, witnesses and committee chair. I appreciate the opportunity today. There it goes. I'm having so much fun with that. Mr. Hornby, Canadian producers compete in a global market. Could you comment at all how the system that has been imposed, for drying grain heating, the cost that has gone up for drying grain and heating barns, are they passed on, or does that just reduce competitiveness on the world stage? And expand on that, please.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for the question. I think the big thing here to think about is that farmers are price takers, not price makers. So when input costs rise, such as adding additional taxes or whatever that may be, like the carbon tax did cause a significant additional cost, especially in a year where we're having to dry, if it's a year where you're trying to dry a lot of grain, or it's a cold year, Manitoba, we get to -40. It's pretty cold here and the summers get hot. So you got to really make sure you keep, for animal welfare purposes, that you keep a consistent temperature in your barns. I think the big thing is that those prices, those costs cannot be passed on to the consumer. The farmer has to eat that, and they're going to be paid for their product, whatever the market is dictating. Sometimes they've already signed a contract for that price. They've locked in a price for part of their crop that year. So they're, if they've locked in that price and the carbon tax goes up, for example, as it did, and thankfully it doesn't exist anymore, but they're eating that cost entirely. And it does cause significant issues because the less money that the producer is going to have is less money that not only they're going to invest in their business, but farmers drive rural economies. And when they have additional dollars in their pocket, they're going to be investing in their communities, whether it's purchasing more products at the local dealer, seed dealer, whether they're buying new equipment, whether they're doing whatever it might be in the community. That's another downfall, is that rural communities thrive when farmers are successful.
Thank you. Do you have any data on how much per acre these carbon taxes are costing operations, or per operation?
Off the top of my head, no, but I could.
Any reports you could submit to the committee?
Yeah, I'll look something up.
Appreciate that. Farmers' contributions on carbon management have been disregarded. You've kind of alluded to that, and others have spoken to it. Carbon credits are rewards, or could be rewards for good practices. Could you explain how, explain the hypocrisy of the circumstance right now? How farmers are doing the right thing, but they're not being rewarded for it?
Yeah. So I think. So you're sorry, if you could just clarify your questions around carbon markets. Is that right?
Carbon markets, how all the good practices farmers are doing aren't being rewarded in the carbon markets.
Yeah, so we've seen a bit of a challenge with carbon markets. It just hasn't really worked for producers. I'm not sure fully what the actual what the issues have been. It just doesn't seem like there's an interest or a demand for that. But I think the way that we should be rewarding producers for their contributions should be through market-based approaches, not through a stick, more through a carrot. So, I think more generally,
for self-started programs.
That's correct. Yeah. And, if we can try and figure out a way to reward those early adopters, the people who are putting their neck out there to do the right thing when it doesn't pay off, I think that would also be welcomed by the industry.
You suggested that with the 4R nutrient management programs that, they're best practices and they're done because they're the right thing to do. There's a value proposition, but there's no rewards in the carbon market.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the reward for the producer is they're going to spend less on inputs and they're going to know that they're doing the right thing. And, 4R protocols can reduce up to 35% of your emissions. So.
No, it's okay. Let's see. As you mentioned, there was overwhelming support among farmers for Bill C-234 to exempt farm fuel use from the carbon tax, yet the government fought hard to stall and water it down. What message did this send to farmers, and how seriously is the Liberal government taking their concerns? You have 30 seconds.
Okay, thank you. I'll try and be quick. I think C-234 was, like I had mentioned, it was a prime example of where industry rallied together, and we saw multiple parties. I met with members from multiple parties, and there was support across Parliament, support across industry, and I think it was just a disappointment and a frustration that farmers were being punished for doing core components of their operation where there was no alternative. If you want to dry grain, you have to use fossil fuel. If you want to heat your lives, here's the thing: we're in a cold climate in Manitoba. It's minus 35.
Thank you.
You have.
Thank you. I'm sorry. For 5 minutes, Mrs. Miedema.
Thank you very much to all the witnesses for today. I know that, excuse me, the current state of play with our emissions in Canada in terms of sectors, we know that the emissions are increasing in the oil and gas sector and also in the agricultural sector. So I've actually been thinking about this and trying to better understand the collaboration with the agricultural sector because we definitely do need to work together on some solutions. So a question for Mr. Rainville. Can you tell us about Clean Prosperity's Net Zero Pathways for Canada project and how Clean Prosperity advocates for Canada's net zero goals? And if you have anything to contribute from an agricultural perspective, I would appreciate that as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. So one of the things we've done was this Net Zero Pathways project where we looked at different pathways for achieving net zero. One of the things that you have to do whenever you're talking about decarbonization is look at it sector by sector to figure out which technologies, when to apply them. It's very different for every industry and for different sectors in Canada. And everything is hyperlocal as well. There's different opportunities to decarbonize in Alberta electrically than there is in Ontario. And there's different options for carbon capture in Alberta than there is in Ontario or Quebec or Nova Scotia. And so it's kind of a broad report that looked at opportunities across the country. In terms of the agricultural sector, it's one that we've had our eye on. There is a natural opportunity, I think as one of the other members of the committee was getting at, to involve agriculture in carbon markets. It's really just a question of how. Agriculture being kind of biogenic sources of carbon can make it very difficult to audit and to monitor in standards that are sought out and looked at in terms of industrial carbon markets. So there are opportunities there and to create what we call offset protocols in order to recognize emissions reductions from cattle, things like that, when you're reducing methane and things like that, and having those rewarded by creating offset credits. There's just technical challenges in terms of the verifiability of those sources of emissions reductions that there aren't when you're talking about a carbon capture storage project, for instance, where you have a flue stack coming out of a facility, and it's much easier to recognize the difference between emissions at one end of the pipe versus the other end.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and I'll note that the federal government recently announced $370 million to provide a per litre production incentive to Canadian biofuel producers. And this is really to help improve the competitiveness of Canadian renewable diesel and biodiesel production, of which canola oil is a key feedstock. So the details are still coming on that, but that is one way to think about supporting the agricultural sector in climate action. Switching to to Ms. McKenzie. I know the Pembina Institute has investigated the costs of clean electricity grids in Atlantic Canada. And one of the major challenges for the federal government is getting provinces to collaborate on the shared infrastructure needs associated with such a project. What role do you see for the federal government in supporting Atlantic provinces with moving towards this initiative?
Yeah, there's certainly a coordination role that the federal government can play, as well as providing policy signals for the cleanliness and the low-emitting nature of the grid over time. Electrification and running as much as possible on low-cost, abundantly available electricity can really be the backbone of Canada's economy, as well as in Atlantic Canada in particular. But to achieve that, we do need a lot more electricity supply than we have today. And we need that supply to be as low-cost as possible, which means wind, solar, and battery storage, which are some of the cheapest forms of power available, but also bolstering them with grid modernization measures, things like better interties between provincial grids to increase their resiliency, as well as efficiency measures to make the most of the electricity that we do have.
Thank you. And just quickly back to Mr. Rainville, you have the 2023 Pillars of Decarbonization report showing how our electricity demand in Canada is going to go up to about 40% in 2050. Can you comment on the need to invest in a clean electricity grid now to accommodate this growing demand and why it's important?
I recently did a panel on nuclear energy and data centers, which I think is emblematic of kind of the questions we have around energy growth or electricity demand in this country. We have new sources of demand, like data centers that are coming online, and there's obviously a lot of interest. But there's other things like electric vehicles and heat pumps, and all of these different pieces collectively mean we're going to need a lot more electricity in the very near term.
Sorry about that. Monsieur Bonnet, pour vous, la parole.
2.5 minutes, Mr. Bonnet. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. McKenzie, I'd like to get back to the credit for production of renewable energy. We heard that municipalities that might take part in these renewable energy projects would not be entitled to those credits. Do you think it should be broadened to municipalities and perhaps Indigenous groups or other institutions?
Investment in renewable power in municipalities and on Indigenous land as well is going to be a really key part of ensuring that low cost and abundant electricity is available for Canadians all across the country, and in particular ways to ensure that there's predictable policy through things like the clean electricity regulations are really key to work with investment tax credits in order to provide the certainty for that kind of investment.
Are you in favor of carbon pricing at the border, as is being done in Europe? Should Canada go ahead with that kind of measure?
Carbon border adjustment mechanisms or pricing carbon at the border can be really key ways to make sure that heavy emitting industries or that industries just generally across the board are not overly exposed to trade or competitiveness pressures globally. With a strong industrial pricing system, Canada can also prepare for other countries or other jurisdictions like the European Union putting in their own carbon border adjustment mechanisms, ensuring that we don't pay a fee to places like the European Union for our emissions. We keep that revenue in Canada to reinvest in emissions reductions. But a carbon border adjustment mechanism that Canada develops can work well in concert with things like domestic industrial pricing to prompt investment in decarbonization both at home and abroad.
Est-ce que selon vous, un nouveau pipeline?
In your opinion, would a pipeline for oil sands be compatible with the Paris Accord or other Canadian commitments?
That would come online from a new oil pipeline, a new large oil pipeline, whether it's to the West Coast or somewhere else, and those would be significant emissions. We would need reductions elsewhere in the economy to make up for the emissions that those bring on. We would also need to really carefully and robustly account for upstream oil and gas emissions, the production of which would go into that pipeline.
Thank you very much. for 5 minutes. Mrs. Anstey, the floor is yours.
Thank you to all of the witnesses. And thank you, Mr. Hornby, for the work you do for rural communities. I represent a very rural riding in Newfoundland and Labrador, and 80% of the goods and services in Newfoundland are brought into the island portion. And one of the things that we hear a lot of conversation around for, close to a decade is how we can really promote this industry and as a province become more food secure. And I'm just curious, is the current Liberal government setting up this industry, particularly as it relates to, expanding a new industry in Newfoundland and Labrador, is the current regulatory environment setting them up for success?
Thanks for the question. We do our work in Manitoba. I can't necessarily speak to the specifics of Newfoundland. However, I would say there are certainly challenges with the current regulatory environment. We look at things like innovation and how does the PMRA, the Pest Management Regulatory Agency, working to promote Canada being on the cutting edge. We have a thorough regulatory oversight in this country. However, we do have instances where Canadian regulations don't align necessarily so well with other jurisdictions, and that does cause challenges for competitiveness for producers. So I think your question, I guess, as well as to the expansion of industry as well, and investment, I think that, something else, there's agricultural policy, but there's also tax policy. There's all these different components as well. We did see proposed changes recently to the capital gains tax treatment, which would have been devastating for farm transitions. However, that has been rescinded, which was positive. So I would say there's been some examples in the past few years where there's been some definite concerns with how that's being dealt with.
Thank you. You also said that when the government introduced the Net Zero Advisory Board, the government failed to include a representative from the agriculture sector when it was established in your opening comments. So I guess further to that, do you think that may have contributed or be an example of growing frustration and erosion of trust that would be amongst farmers?
I think more broadly, the general feeling from farmers is that they want to be in at the ground floor. They want to be there because they have a perspective and knowledge that maybe others don't have, because when it comes to agriculture, this is something that's been passed on for generations in most cases from their parents. A parent has passed it on to their child, and they've learned and seen throughout the years what's worked, what hasn't, through trial and error, through lots of dollars and successes as well. And that's the thing. So I think that there has been some efforts to include producers in consultations. I won't dispute that. I've been at many of those consultation sessions. However, when you're consulting with farmers, having them in at the ground floor and having them shape the discussion is really key.
Thank you. And I just want to give you an opportunity to expand on something that you mentioned in your opening statements. You had said that farmers understood that cutting emissions by 30% without cutting fertilizer use is simply not realistic, especially with today's crop yields and soil conditions. So I'm just curious about what you've heard from farmers and producers in terms of the kind of impacts that they have had to face because of caps like fertilizer emissions cap, now the oil and gas emissions cap, and the carbon tax. And are these regulations practical in a real life sense?
So I think on the emissions with fertilizer, the 30% reduction that was discussed, I can't recall this, maybe it was 3 years ago, excuse me. It created a lot of fear with producers and the impact. So that was not a regulatory approach. That was more of we're going to set this target, and it was not communicated well. And this is an instance where we've seen in the past where governments have brought forward ideas without consulting industry fully and without providing all of the details. So there was a sentiment of, they're going to cut our fertilizer use by 30%, because That's the only way you can reduce emissions by that much with fertilizer use. There's a bit of a duality as well, where agriculture is being asked to produce more food, fuel, and fiber for various inputs on one hand, and on the other hand, there's a push to reduce the emissions. So I think what we need to do is say we can't have both all the time. We have to really make sure that we're.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Pour vous, Monsieur Bonnet, 2.5
Mr. Bonnet?
minutes.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Rainville, can you give us your definition of climate competitiveness and how it helps us reach both our imperatives of being competitive in a world economy, but also reaching our GHG objectives too?
Yeah, thank you for that. The number one, or one of the significant things that's talked about when you talk about carbon policy and carbon border adjustments and all of these different pieces is carbon leakage. It's actually kind of an inelegant term because it doesn't really describe what you're talking about very well. It's not kind of understandable by an average person. And what it is it's industry responding to industrial policies such as industrial pricing by changing jurisdictions. And so what you want when you're looking for good, robust climate policy is something that avoids this carbon leakage. You avoid a facility moving from jurisdiction A to jurisdiction B because it has favorable treatment in one province versus another, for instance. And so when we talk about climate competitiveness, and I know the government has a forthcoming climate competitiveness strategy that we're going to be looking forward to, what you want is something that will reduce emissions but maintain the jobs in the industry in the country so that you don't have this kind of a depression effect on industry, but you have an environment in which industry can grow, it can produce in the same time as reduce emissions.
Thank you. Mr. Hornby, in your opening statement, you talked about how farmers have a tremendous vested interest in the environment. They make their living from the environment. I live in a riding that is both on the edge of the city, but very much in the country as well. And I meet with farmers all the time. I know that they're very hardworking, practical, and focused on outcomes. I was wondering if you could share with us some practical solutions that you see based on your experience in Manitoba, where the agricultural sector can help Canada meet its objectives in addressing climate change while also making sure our farmers continue to thrive.
Thanks for the question. I think there's a lot that can be done. A lot of it is as well the way that we're dealing with approaching the problem. So I mentioned earlier the 4R nutrient stewardship agreement we have in Manitoba. That's a positive one. It's finding those areas of common ground. It's leaning really into the knowledge that producers have. I think it's avoiding anything that will punish their operations where there is no alternative. This was the big challenge when it came to the carbon tax, was that there was no alternative. So that was the issue. So that's a big thing for sure. I think it's those market-based incentives that would really be a good approach to do. There has been some success through programs like the On-Farm Climate Action Fund, where I've heard from producers that having the funds available to adopt best management practices that work on their operation, flexibility like that is what's really key, because every operation, even a mile down the road, is going to be different than the next one. And I'm sure you know that from speaking to producers in your backyard.
Okay, thank you. And Ms. McKenzie, the Conservative opposition members are on record of opposing market-based solutions to addressing the climate crisis, as well as non-market-based solutions. Are there other solutions that we're not looking at, or is this just a reflection of the fact that they do not have an environmental policy?
Yeah, I'd like to highlight answer your question, market-based solutions and non-market-based solutions, the latter being things like policy and regulation that obligate firms to reduce their emissions, they both have a role in reducing emissions, in stimulating investment in low-carbon emerging industries. And I'd like to highlight the electricity sector again here. In terms of what climate competitiveness could mean in that sector, Canada's projected to be operating a 90% emissions-free grid by 2030, which puts us just second after France amongst the G7. But there are a lot of countries now joining the clean electricity race. So if Canada wants to retain our clean power advantage, we can't really afford to let demand growth result in new multi-decade investments in high-emitting, high-cost gas and coal power stations. So we need both market and non-market mechanisms in order to ensure that we can stay apace with the rest of the world. We've already seen massive cost reductions in renewable power, and I will stop there.
So I would like to thank all the witnesses for their testimony this morning, and the witnesses are now excused. The meeting will suspend while we prepare the next witness panel. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Le comité reprend son étude de l'efficacité.
We are resuming our study of the effectiveness, potential improvements, and capability of Canada's 2030 emissions reduction plan.
With the following witnesses. À titre personnel, l'honorable Sonia Savage.
The Honourable Sonia Savage, as an individual.
À la crise tarifaire et climatique, Mr. David Miller, ancien maire. And from the Coalition of Chiefs, Dale Swampy, President, Director General. Thank you, witnesses, for being here today. When you're going to see this yellow sign going up, it indicates there's 1 minute left to your allocation, to your opening remarks, and turn it over. That means time is up. Thank you. And every witness has 5 minutes for their opening remarks, and we will begin with Sonia Savage. Thank you.
Well, does this come on? Yes, it does. Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm senior counsel at Borden Ladner Gervais, having returned to the private sector after serving as Minister of Energy and Minister of Environment for the province of Alberta. In 2023, I released Alberta's Emission Reduction and Energy Development Plan, a plan to cut emissions to net zero by 2050 without compromising affordable, reliable, and secure energy. Since leaving government, I now spend a significant amount of my time working with and advising companies that are pursuing projects in the clean energy space. Let me state at the outset that the science is clear that global temperatures are rising and that urgent action is needed to reduce emissions. But urgency cannot simply ignore feasibility. Any climate roadmap needs to be achievable. It serves no purpose to pick rigid, inflexible targets that cannot be reached. Canada has a long history of missing targets, and we're not on track to meet 2030. This is unfortunate, but it's also not a surprise. To be successful, there needs to be collaboration, and that has been missing. Over the past decade, Ottawa has ignored advice from industry and trampled provincial jurisdiction. Fortunately, there are signs of a more pragmatic approach. I was encouraged to hear Prime Minister Carney say that a new climate competitiveness strategy will focus on results over objectives. If this means that both the climate and economy are important, then maybe the economic decline that we've seen can be curbed. A new climate competitiveness strategy could also better align provincial and federal climate plans and focus on areas that are working. 3 areas that come to mind are carbon capture, industrial carbon pricing, and critical minerals. Without carbon capture, it's not possible to achieve net zero. Alberta and Ottawa have already made significant progress incentivizing carbon capture. This is not just about the oil sands and the Pathways Initiative, but also about multiple sectors across the economy, from power generation to hydrogen, cement, fertilizer, petrochemicals, and steel. In 2022, Alberta awarded rights to 25 carbon sequestration hubs across the province. And what is needed for these hubs to be successful is supportive policy. Industrial carbon pricing, if priced right and left to the province to implement, can help attract investment into a low-carbon economy. Alberta's TIER program, which dates back to 2007, is a great example. That's why it was left in place in Alberta's 2023 climate plan. Without critical minerals such as lithium, cobalt, nickel, and uranium, energy transition is not possible. Developing a full value chain from extraction to processing and manufacturing should be an essential part of not only climate policy, but also economic, industrial, and foreign policy. There is a key characteristic to all 3 things I just mentioned, and that is collaboration with the provinces and industry. But there are other areas in Ottawa's climate plan that creates unnecessary conflict. The clean electricity regs and the oil and gas emissions cap are divisive policies that will lead to economic harm and constitutional challenges. The emissions cap, if implemented, will be a production cap. Industry says they can't meet the cap without reducing production. The result will be more capital moving to other jurisdictions, undermining Canada's ability to be a conventional and clean energy superpower. The clean electricity regs are unachievable for natural gas generators. Alberta's system operator, the ISO, says that there are no technical, affordable alternatives that can make compliance possible. In 2024, after getting completely off coal-fired electricity, Alberta's grid now relies on natural gas for 75% of total power, and much more power will be needed in the years ahead for electrification of both the transportation and heating. In conclusion, when Alberta developed its 2023 climate plan, I saw an opportunity to align climate policy with industrial policy. Climate policy, if done right, not only reduces emissions, but can also attract investments into new areas such as carbon capture, hydrogen, battery storage, clean tech, and renewables. It can also support oil and gas and kickstart the development of critical minerals. I see that same opportunity now if Canada's new climate competitiveness strategy can better balance climate and the economy to achieve the goal of being a conventional and clean energy superpower. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mrs. Savage. Mr. Swampy, for 5 minutes, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Climate change, inflation, Indigenous reconciliation. These are undoubtedly complex policy problems, complex for policy wonks and outright mystical for everyone else, because addressing them causes an avalanche of unintended consequences to Canada's entire economy, including First Nation communities. How can we solve climate change when addressing it drives up the prices of consumer goods? Or how are we supposed to support Indigenous reconciliation if our government in power is unable to implement effective and sustainable climate change policy? If you change your perspective, you can see different narratives that provide an opportunity to address these challenges combined. The complexity and interconnectedness of our greatest challenges can be a strength. It can lead to outside the box thinking and new and innovative solutions that finally move us forward in these critical areas where there has been so little progress to date. However, to unlock this opportunity, we must move away from short-term thinking of most politicians who merely focus on their own political agendas. We must move away from politicizing these challenges and break with the narratives that continuously bring us the same poor results. Many Indigenous people follow the philosophy of 7-generational thinking. The main idea is that a decision you make today needs to benefit people 7 generations from now. In a democracy like ours, that is much further in the future than the next election. If we apply this idea to our most significant challenges, climate change, inflation, and Indigenous reconciliation, we can look beyond popular narratives and focus on the real problems. We can talk about climate change without villainizing an entire industry. We can see that further stifling the energy industry with new emission caps has driven up the price of consumer goods, fueling inflation, increasing unemployment, creating unmanageable heating, electricity costs, all of which combined would result in overall cross-sectional societal lowering of our standard of living. Looking at Canada's challenges holistically and respecting their interconnectedness will allow us to find solutions that make a positive difference in all those areas. Almost 14,000 self-identified Indigenous people work in Canada's oil and gas industry. Their incomes benefit their families and their communities across this country, allowing for significant progress in areas to address poverty and inequality experienced by Indigenous people. With billions of dollars invested over the past decades, the same energy companies that facilitate economic independence and self-determination for all these Indigenous communities have become global leaders in producing clean energy. They have reduced greenhouse gas emissions unlike companies in any other country, and lead the way to innovative carbon tech solutions that will finally make achieving Canada's emissions targets possible. The authors of this legislation either didn't see the relevance of their emissions cap proposal for Indigenous people or they don't care. Frankly, both are possible, but the latter appears more likely. They say that they did speak to some Indigenous people while ignoring the diversity of our community and following the false narrative that all Indigenous people oppose energy projects. Regardless of the reasoning, when all is said and done, 14,000 Indigenous people, their families, and their communities will suffer from the outcome without ever having given the opportunity to express themselves. Instead, Ottawa will decide, and Indigenous communities will face the consequences of linear thinking applied by a paternalistic government that thinks in short-term political frameworks. Instead of applying visionary thinking that would benefit future generation of Canadians, the government's taking steps to further inhibit progress to appease small voter demographics with the greenwashing policy solution on climate change that will hurt Indigenous and non-Indigenous alike, today, tomorrow, and 7 generations from now. Thank you.
For 5 minutes, the floor is... Sorry about that. To Mr. Miller.
Thank you. I'm the co-chair of Elbows Up for Climate, a coalition of over 250 mayors and councillors working together to ensure that Canada prioritizes climate action and economic sovereignty. And as you mentioned, I'm the former mayor of Toronto, the former chair of the Ontario Auto Industry Mayors, and I currently work on climate issues as the managing director of the C40 Centre. I'm speaking today from the traditional territories of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, including the Songhees and Esquimalt nations. My comments will focus on the importance of building Canada's economic independence by choosing nation-building climate projects. This summer, our country literally has been on fire from coast to coast to coast. Well over 200 communities were impacted by wildfires and more by flooding. Manitoba and Saskatchewan both declared states of emergency. And communities that are not directly impacted are often hosting climate refugees for weeks and months at a time. The impacts our communities are facing are widespread and devastating. From Jasper's cleanup costs to massive home insurance increases in Yellowknife to estimates of the insured damages from the Flin Flon and La Ronde at $300 million and counting. Why should everyday Canadians bear the cost of inaction? Without urgent action to tackle climate change, studies suggest that Canada is on track for $100 billion per year in climate damages by 2050. These are just 3 examples. There are many more. That's certainly part of the reason why the overwhelming majority of Canadians demand climate action, because climate change is real and the impacts are serious and getting worse. Science shows that it's primarily caused by the burning of fossil fuels and that the world needs to nearly halve their use by 2030. That's only possible if Canada does its part. The good news? Climate action is nation building. It can help us build the made in Canada economy we need, far more resilient and less dependent on our neighbor. The asks of our campaign are clear. Create a national east-west-north clean electricity grid. Build a national high-speed rail network. Build at least 2 million non-market energy-efficient homes. Make our homes and buildings warmer in winter, cooler in summer with retrofits and heat pump installations across the country. And fund a national resilience, response, and recovery strategy so our communities can prepare for the climate disasters we know are coming, respond when they are hit, and rebuild afterwards. In closing, it is critical that the voice of communities suffering climate disasters be heard. We know that the voice of the oil and gas industry has been heard. Public records show over 600 meetings between the government and oil and gas lobbyists since January, with 50 meetings with Minister Hodgson since the elections, an average of 2 a week. The voice of the majority who want climate action and to live in safe, resilient, and economically strong communities needs an equal place at the table. For example, to point out the simple scientific fact that we have to reduce reliance on fossil fuels rapidly, not increase it. There is no grand bargain with science. And to make the point that the fossil fuel majors who made $35 billion in profits in 2022 alone do not need public subsidies. Ottawa's funding should instead be invested in projects that create the jobs of the future. Nation building, not nation burning projects. Today, there is an exceptional opportunity and duty to build the future we need. The government's plan needs to be significantly more ambitious, applying the polluter pays principle more rigorously and prioritizing climate-forward nation-building projects that are crucial for our short-term reality and long-term prosperity. Mayors and councillors across the country understand the challenges this government faces when it comes to threats from the USA. The jobs of our residents are on the line. Allowing our communities to burn, be flooded, or otherwise damaged by a climate-related disaster is actually a choice, one we do not need to make if Canada plays its part in ensuring the world avoids climate breakdown. Thank you.
Please. Sorry, Mr. Ross, for 6 minutes.
Thank you for your presentations. And Mr. Swampy, good to see you again. The National Coalition of Chiefs mission statement emphasizes that you wish to defeat unreserved poverty through resource development. What does meaningful economic participation look like for First Nations individuals and communities?
Well, it's clear that in the past 150 years, First Nations have not been involved in Canada's natural resource industry. And the National Coalition of Chiefs recognizes this and would like more, participatory inclusion in major projects. If we had, ownership in the giant mine in Northwest Territories back in the 50s and 60s, we wouldn't have the economic or the environmental destruction we have right now. But if there were Northwest Territory First Nation members on the boards of these big corporations, you wouldn't see the environmental damage you have today. And the oil and gas industry is moving towards that. Right now we have, the big six getting First Nation people on their boards and helping them to manage the economic or the environmental protection plan that is going in place right now out there. We have, myself on the board for the Emission Reductions Alberta, who has funded over $1 billion to advance technological research into finding new sources of sustainable green energy. So it's these kind of movements that are moving forward, and we're proud to be part of the oil and gas industry and doing what we can for the 14,000 self-identified Indigenous workers in that industry.
Thank you. And First Nation leaders are in a tough spot, especially if they're under the Indian Act, which is very, very strict. But First Nation leaders have had to balance environmental issues with the standing of living objectives that Canada has not been able to achieve, and which First Nations are trying to achieve on their own through resource development. What's your response to critics who claim that resource development and Indigenous rights are at odds?
Well, I don't think that resource development right now and First Nation rights are at a head. I believe that the oil and gas industry has turned around, has become more inclusive in terms of getting First Nations involved in their operations. We've seen that since the ESG guidelines that come through, as well as the DEI requirements for corporations has come through, and we've seen a lot of work through developing Indigenous relations policies that match communities that they operate with, communities that exist within their areas of operations. And the NCC is working towards, getting extra consideration for our people to transition from the unemployed lifestyle to the employed lifestyle. Some 60% of our people are on social welfare. We want to get away from that. And we need the Canadian people, the Canadian government, and industry to give us extra consideration to move us from the unemployed lifestyle to the employed lifestyle. You've seen that with Port MacKay First Nation, one of the biggest and most wealthiest nations in North America, some medium income of over $100,000 per household. But it didn't happen overnight. It took 50 years of companies like the Suncors and the Cenovus to commit themselves to getting our people in Fort MacKay transitioned from the unemployed lifestyle to the employed lifestyle. And natural resource industry is our biggest industry. We can't turn our back on that. The world requires us to be able to supply them the resources they need to be able to power their economies and so forth. And we can't stop that by saying that clean energy is a priority and that we must kill the natural resource industry. That's not going to work. If we kill our own industry, we're not going to have the economy we need to be able to fund clean energy projects like the emission reductions Alberta is doing. We've got Canadian companies like Caleres Solutions doing, inventing technologies that get rid of emissions. So we got to move forward with something like that rather than doing a stopgap solution that's being created right now with this legislation.
Thank you. And many First Nations have expressed support for pipelines as a path to prosperity. Why do you think that support is often ignored by provincial and federal governments, or even media outlets for that matter? Why is it ignored?
Because there's no, ability for them to be able to access the, areas of their political agenda that are important to them. We've come to a situation where politics has become exclusive politics, where individuals are acting on only one side of the scope. We elect our officials to do, things that are important for us. And in order to do those things and make those decisions, they must become informed. And in order to be informed, you got to look at all sides of the argument in this. I mean, with Northern Gateway, we had over 75% of the communities supporting it and signing on as owners. We tried to meet with the Prime Minister at that time, Pierre Trudeau, and he wouldn't meet with us. And then in November of 2016, he announced the cancellation of Northern Gateway, saying that...
Thank you, Mr. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. For 6 minutes, Mr. Grant.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, witnesses, for attending. Mr. Miller, I hope you're having a good day in the territory of my cousins, the Lekwungen-speaking people. I'm from the Musqueam Nation on the other side of the Salish Sea in Vancouver Quadra, and I grew up there. In my early days of elementary school is when I first begun understanding the effects of climate change. And my city, the city of Vancouver, has been at the forefront of trying to tackle that. I know you have a lot of experience in this. I just want to know if there are examples from cities that you would recommend that we follow the lead of at a federal level.
Yes, there are very significant examples globally of cities undertaking real climate action that both creates jobs, industries, and reduces reliance dramatically on burning fossil fuels. The key areas from my perspective are transportation, how we generate electricity, how we manage waste, and buildings. And I'll give a couple. Shenzhen, China, has completely electrified its bus fleet and its taxi fleets, and in doing so became the world's leading manufacturer, or at least a company in Shenzhen, the world's leading manufacturer of electric vehicles. At a time that we're facing challenges in southwestern Ontario because of the actions of the USA, it gives a great precedent. A second is your own city of Vancouver. Its building code is probably the leading building code in the world in terms of reducing reliance on fossil fuels, particularly gas, and dramatically reducing emissions. It's a model that should be copied by all provinces and cities across the country.
Oh, thanks, Mr. Miller. Yes, and I want to know where I live. The University of British Columbia is in my riding, and when I try to get my kids to school, it takes me longer than average because there's so much traffic backed up, and transit is desperately needed. I just wanted to know what interventions in transit and buildings actually do you see being needed to deliver emissions reductions at the federal level?
My brother-in-law is your constituent, by the way, and my sister-in-law. I'm sure they say hello. Building cities that are oriented towards public transit, walking, and cycling is done worldwide, and we can learn from those best examples. For example, the Broadway subway, once built, will change your neighborhood for the better. But it's an example of system-wide thinking, and there are many excellent examples of cities that are taking bold steps. London with its ultra-low emission zone, Paris, and others to densify their city around public transit, walking and cycling, which dramatically reduces the need for people to rely on cars, whether they're clean or not. We can do that in all of our cities across Canada. It's nothing to do with attacking the oil and gas industry. It's about building better, more affordable places for people to live that are easier to get around and less expensive and greener and more pleasant to live. If you build a city around transit, walking, and cycling, that's the result. And that's why so many cities globally are taking those steps.
You mentioned about waste, and I know that emissions from landfills and others are very concerning. Do you know how the Green Municipal Fund or related federal programs are helping curb emissions from landfills, and what is needed to be able to allow for municipalities across Canada to manage their waste more effectively? I drive by the waste in my territory, and I know a lot of it's being shipped up into the interior as well.
Well, I think, first of all, we need to minimize the amount of waste we produce, and there are lots of people working on that issue. With respect to the Green Municipal Fund, it's been a very forward-thinking program that has empowered municipalities across this country, large and small, to experiment with doing the right thing for the environment and the right thing for climate. Waste, in particular, methane capture at landfills is essential. Source separation so we can compost is essential. And the Green Municipal Fund, to my understanding, has supported a number of projects in smaller municipalities that have allowed them to learn from places like Toronto, which have been undertaking those techniques for some years.
Thank you. Mr. Swampy, I know that you mentioned that having First Nations on boards is important to bring the knowledge from First Nations from many, many generations behind. Do you agree that First Nations knowledge and traditional knowledge is important when moving forward with these types of developments?
Yeah, it's not only important, it's necessary. Our people, went through all of the government processes of trying to assimilate us into society and failed. Understanding First Nations and what they desire is important because we're not leaving. Our communities will be there in time and memoriam and will continue to be there for centuries to come. And for us to be able to be a part of a industry that reaps the benefits of the natural resources in Canada, which there are a lot, has to include First Nation people because we're the land stewards of the land. We appreciate the environmental protection plans that our Canadian industry implements, and we want to be part of that. We want to be part of that monitoring and ensuring these environmental protection plans are done properly and are done in a manner so that when the company leaves.
Thank you. For 5 minutes, for 6 minutes, Monsieur Bonnet.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Miller, I'd like to hear you about the cost of inaction on the climate file. The Bloc Québécois did a study about the cost to households and in general. Could you elaborate a little more about the cost to members of your coalition and whether measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions would reduce those costs?
Well, the costs of climate disasters in Canada are incredibly significant. And, a perfect example is Jasper. Jasper prepared tremendously because it knew about the risk of wildfires and knew that wildfires were being made more violent and more likely because of climate-related weather changes. Despite those preparations, 30% of Jasper burned down. And think about the impact on the residents of Jasper. For most of us, our home is our biggest single investment. And many, many residents of Jasper lost their home, had to deal with an unfamiliar experience in insurance. And because the entire town was affected, had literally nowhere to go. Adding to this, of course, the businesses. The costs are extraordinary. And, we can't adapt our way out of climate, A, because the costs are big, B, because these kinds of damages are so significant. And I think this needs to be front and center when we're thinking about Canada's climate strategy. Should we do our part, do what we've agreed with other nations so that nations together can address the problem? Or do we want to face many more Jaspers over time? And, we saw this summer Newfoundland on fire, for example. I certainly never thought I'd see in my lifetime Newfoundland on fire. This is real. It's serious. The costs are immense. And once the headlines are over, the recovery continues. Jasper is still rebuilding and will be for a very long time. And it's not the only one.
Dans votre lettre.
In the letter that you wrote to the party leaders before the election, you had several demands. I'd like to know whether you could table that letter with the committee and tell us about subsidies to fossil fuels. You talked about ceasing those subsidies and using that money. You could perhaps confirm that. And maybe you could explain why, in your opinion, the federal government continues to subsidize fossil fuels. Last year, $28.5 billion.
Oui, c'est très important.
Yes, it's very important. Thank you for that question.
Continues to subsidize fossil fuel companies. Indeed, we see new demands for subsidies, for example, for carbon capture and storage. The letter is clear. The nation-building projects we propose, such as a clean energy grid, coast to coast to coast, to not just bring clean energy everywhere in this country, but also to create new industries, create massive numbers of jobs, connecting the grids, and to dramatically reduce reliance on diesel, which is very expensive for our northern communities. If subsidies are needed, they should go to these kinds of forward-looking projects. I personally, and not speaking on behalf of Elbows Up, I have a great deal of difficulty accepting the fact that Canada's oil majors, who made $35 billion in profits in 2022 alone during COVID, should get further subsidies to do what's right for the environment, right for the people of Canada, and right for climate. They have the money. And innovative new ideas are the ones that need support and should be where the government puts its money.
Au Bloc québécois, on a...
In the Bloc québécois, in our election platform, we proposed doubling funding for public transit. In your opinion, is that a good demand? And should the federal government play more of a role by sending money to the provinces and municipalities for this? Yes, it's very important. Public transport is very important.
Lifeblood of communities. When I was in office in Toronto, we negotiated the New Deal for cities and communities with the federal government and provinces for national funding for cities and towns, including direct funding for public transit. That federal funding is important on this issue because public transit, particularly clean electric transit, electric buses, for example, is of a national interest. Seeing our cities succeed economically is of national importance, and reaching our environmental goals, which really can only be met with excellent public transit across the country, is of national importance as well. And I applaud the position to double funding. And if this Parliament can make a priority to support Canada's cities and public transit agencies far more strongly, including...
Thank you. Thank you. For 5 minutes, Mrs. Asti, the floor is yours.
Thank you to the witnesses, and thank you, Ms. Savage. I'm going to direct my questions towards you. We've watched the federal government through policies like the 2030 Emissions Reduction Plan effectively target Canada's oil and gas sector. But now the tone seems to be shifting. The government is talking about becoming an energy superpower, building at lightning speed, and driving new investment. Yet we still see the emissions cap. With your extensive and diverse experience in law, government, and the private sector, I'd really like your insight on this. Can we be an energy superpower with the emissions cap? And if not, can you expand on why?
Well, sure. I think we have the ability to be both a clean energy superpower and a conventional energy superpower. We have the ability to be a clean energy superpower, attract investments into new things like hydrogen and clean fuels, critical minerals, new tech. And that's important, but it's also important if we want to be a conventional and energy superpower. That means oil and gas. And I don't believe the emissions cap and the clean electricities regulations are consistent with that at all. If the cap leads to a production cut, which industry says it will, then how can we expand to new and growing markets? We'll continue to be dependent on one market, primarily on one market, the United States. We need to be able to expand our production, to grow markets and develop beyond the United States. The emissions cap is particularly challenging for industry because when they make an investment decision, they have to know, whether it's in clean tech or whether it's where they have their production, they have to know that their investment is, that the project they're investing in is going to cover capital costs, it's going to cover the costs of financing, and it's going to cover operational costs. And if the emissions cap make that unaffordable, make other alternatives in other jurisdictions more investable, we'll lose production, and we won't be able to be an energy superpower. Likewise, with the clean electricity regulations, as many of you probably heard already, Alberta's electricity grid we're completely off coal, but we're 75% dependent on natural gas regulation. Our gas generators have said they cannot comply with the clean electricity regs as drafted. If we want to be a superpower in both clean energy and conventional energy, we need to support natural gas power generation. That'll support the development of data centers and AI, and both of those regulations are not consistent. On top of that, they're layered onto industrial carbon pricing, which in my view has worked well. Industrial carbon pricing has worked well for both the province and Canada since 2007 in Alberta. Those two regulations layer on top of it. It layers an added layer of complexity. And if we can strengthen and keep the industrial carbon price strong, we do not need the emissions cap or the clean electricities regs. We can do all we need to do to be a clean energy superpower and a conventional energy superpower with working with the provinces and ensuring that we have a robust industrial carbon tax.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Just going back to the targets, Canada is currently projected to achieve only 30 to 35% emissions reduction by 2030, falling short of its 40 to 50% target. At the 48th Canada-United States Law Institute annual conference, you stated it's irresponsible to legislate something that you can't meet, noting that such policies merely export labor and emissions to countries with weaker regulations, effectively transferring economic power and global security abroad. Can you just elaborate quickly on that point? I think it's important.
Well, sure. When you pick a random target for emissions target that you have no ability to meet, that you can't meet, industry will you'll see carbon leakage. Industry will invest somewhere else. We'll see production transfer to other jurisdictions. If we leave a barrel of oil in the ground here in Canada, in Alberta, it'll come out of the ground somewhere else in the world. In countries that have less stable democracies, countries that have lower emissions reduction targets, and it'll be a transfer of not only production, but of wealth and emissions. And that can tend to stabilize, cause geopolitical instability.
Et à vous la parole, Monsieur Saint-Pierre, pour 5 minutes.
Merci. Monsieur Miller, quelle importance dirais-tu que les villes canadiennes auraient pour qu'on puisse rencontrer nos...
Perhaps we could meet our targets by 2030 or 2050.
I'm sorry, I missed the first part of your question.
Happy to ask it in English. So how important would you say Canadian cities are towards meeting Canada's 2030 or even 2050 targets?
Extremely important. As you know from the document before you, the plan before you, a very significant proportion of Canada's emissions are in buildings, how we build them, how we operate them, how we heat and cool them, and transportation. And properly empowered and properly resourced, our cities can help retrofit buildings, help build public transport that dramatically reduces emissions. There are other things we could do as well in cities. For example, the United States president has said that he does not want to invest in electric vehicles. Could we help rebuild our auto industry, which is at risk today, through city-based thinking about greening fleets? Delivery fleets, taxi fleets, other fleets, as China has done and created a significant industry as well.
And what would you say are the approximate percentage of emissions that come from cities in Canada?
I don't have that figure off the top of my head. I'm sorry, Mr. St. Pierre, but it's quite significant. Approximately 80% of Canadians live in urban areas. And globally, 70% of global emissions are attributable to cities or the activities required to sustain them, a power plant outside a city, for example. And I do have to challenge a little bit of some of the comments today. It's not possible to have an all of the above strategy. You know, science tells us we need to reduce emissions, not just Canada, but everybody. And things like natural gas plants increase emissions. That's a scientific fact. And I think the opportunity from an urban perspective is to generate clean energy, build clean transportation, and run our buildings fossil fuel free. That's all possible. It's done somewhere in the world today. We just need to take the best practice examples and properly fund our cities and towns so they can help make the changes needed rapidly.
And which cities in Canada would you say are leading and which ones are lagging in meeting our 2030 targets?
Le numéro un, c'est Montréal. Montreal is doing an excellent job. Toronto was leading. It's by virtue of a city-based climate strategy and the closing of the Lakeview coal-fired plant. Its greenhouse gas emissions were over 30% below 1990 levels as of 2024, I think, independently verified. And it's an interesting example because Toronto in that time period economically boomed. In fact, perhaps too much. Vancouver has also showed historically very good leadership, particularly around buildings, as I commented before.
Great, thank you.
And Halifax. Sorry, I have to mention Halifax.
So I have a minute and a half left. And if it's okay, I'll cede the last minute and a half to my colleague from Halifax.
Thank you, witnesses. And Mr. Miller, I was just going to forgive you for not listing Halifax, so thank you for doing so. You know, coming from a city and working really hard to use science to set a target, you know, I don't think we can say that these targets are random or illogical. They are absolutely what we need to do. Otherwise, we're just rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. We're not getting to the actual required goal. So, Mr. Miller, I wonder if you could speak to that and the importance of actually having ambitious targets, whether you are perfectly tracking or not, and how that's going to help us get to where we need to go in terms of our 2050 target. Thank you.
My work is for C40 Cities, a coalition of the mayors of the world's largest cities, representing probably about 900 million people in their urban regions. each of those cities has a scientifically based climate plan with targets that are based on their fair share of doing what science says is necessary. It's true, not all of them are on track. Most of them are ahead of their national governments. They're reducing emissions on a per capita basis. And it's because they relied on science, set their targets based on science.
Thank you, Mr. Miller.
And of course,
All right.
je m'excuse.
Thank
Je
you.
comprends.
For 2.5 minutes, Monsieur Bonnet, la parole est à vous.
Mr. Bonnet. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Miller. It's nice to hear someone who has vision and ambition. I'd like to hear your views on the potential decree by the federal government, the Fund for Active Transport, $400 million over 5 years. In your opinion, is that fund important for active transport? And should the federal government keep it in place?
It's important to support active transport. I think one could make an argument that perhaps even more significant investment is needed. Active transport matters because you change the nature of a city or a town if it becomes built in a way that does not require the operation of a vehicle. And if we think about things like addressing Canada's aging population and many other issues beyond climate, building that sort of city and town for people to be able to live healthy, active lives produces other significant public policy benefits as well. So the concept, absolutely, whether the money's adequate, I would suspect much more would be welcome as well.
Vous parlez beaucoup de, je pense, de 2 millions.
You talked about 2 million green homes and money to create affordable houses and the importance of renovating buildings and houses. Could you talk about that a little more? Do you think the federal government should do more on that chapter?
Yes, I'm worried that in a push to rapidly address our affordable housing crisis, and by the way, all of the mayors and councillors are worried on the same issue, or the ones that are part of our coalition, in the push to address the affordable housing crisis, are going to build poor quality housing. And housing that requires little or no dirty energy to operate is actually housing that over time is inexpensive to use. And when you think about building housing, it lasts for a very long time. We need to think about the long run, not just about the immediate cost. So it's an extremely important issue that federal housing programs, first of all, produce enough affordable housing, and secondly, do it in a way that the buildings are sustainable and therefore low cost to operate and affordable for the residents.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. And I would like to thank all the witnesses for their testimony today.
Are we not having another round?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Merci beaucoup.
So the clerk tells me we can go for another 15 minutes. Okay, so time was up for Mr. Bonnet. Next would be Mr. Bexty.
Sorry, just want to clarify, 50 or 15?
1-5.
1-5, okay.
Point d'ordre, Monsieur le
You have
Président.
5 minutes.
Point d'ordre, Monsieur le Président.
Point of order.
On a perdu un témoin.
We lost a witness. Inaudible.
Je suis certain que mon collègue conservateur voudra son...
I'm sure my conservative colleague would like to put a question.
Oui, mais...
Yes, we do. Mr. Savage.
If you have questions for Mrs. Savage, you can start.
Absolutely. Ms. Savage, again, thank you for being here. Alberta's been a leader in energy of all types and a leader in economic growth. The province has recognized the need to reduce emissions while still growing the economy. And I feel it's important to note here that there are no prosperous, high-cost energy jurisdictions in the world, so the price of energy to the consumer is important. But much of Alberta's emissions are industrial, and for far more than other provinces. What opportunities does that create for Alberta?
The emissions profile from Alberta is different than most of the other provinces. If you look at the emissions profile, about over 2/3 of the emissions in Alberta, it's about a little over 250 megatons. Most of our emissions, 2/3, come from the industrial sector. It's the flip side in a lot of other provinces that only 1/3 come from the industrial sector. The rest come from consumer uses and individual uses. That creates both some challenges and some opportunities for Alberta. And Alberta's, I've heard it in the committee quite regularly that Alberta's a laggard. Well, we're not. It's a very different emission profile with the industrial emissions. It can be challenging to reduce those emissions because a number of these industrial sectors are in hard to abate industries, whether it's oil and gas, heavy industry, petrochemical production. Those are trade-exposed industries that if you challenge them and you make them uneconomic, the investment and the projects and the wealth will just shift to other jurisdictions. But it also creates opportunities. I'm always trying to be positive, but I believe it also creates opportunities. And that's because to reduce the emissions in these types of industries can attract investment. It can attract investment in things like CCUS, hydrogen, in clean fuels, sustainable aviation fuel. So attracting that investment creates jobs. So that's why I've said and always look at climate policy, if it's done right, if it balances the economy and emissions reduction, if it's done at a pace and scale that technology and capital investment and regulatory process and supply chains can support the emissions reduction, it becomes good industrial policy, attracting jobs and investment, improving the economy. And that's why I say our emissions profile in Alberta is both an opportunity and a challenge. And Alberta's doing a very good job, and they have for a very long time, of reducing emissions. It was the very first jurisdiction in North America to put a price on carbon. That was in 2007. It was also the very first jurisdiction in North America to bring in methane emission reductions. We got completely off of coal-fired electricity generation in 2024, and all of those policies were facilitated through provincial action, not through federal action, and through working collaboratively with the federal government. So Alberta's doing its part. Our emissions profile are highly in the industrial space, so I just wanted to point that it's a challenge and an opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. Have we got another witness back yet?
Not yet, sir. No.
Okay. Further, there's been a lot of discussion by some of the witnesses and over the course of meetings about investing in projects and investing in the investment has to come from somewhere. And it's great to talk about this stuff when it's other people's money. But primary industries are the only real way to generate new capital and new wealth. And the recent layoffs of major companies in Alberta, ConocoPhillips, Enbridge, Imperial, this is a trend that is disturbing and could undermine, economic success in the near future. What measures do you believe are necessary to restore investor confidence?
Well, I think we need to need to be competitive in both our fiscal measures as well as environment measures. If we're bringing in, and to speak back to the emissions reduction plan and addressing climate change, which the committee is studying, we have to bring in policies that reduce emissions in a way that does not frighten away investment. When companies are choosing to invest, whether it's to grow their production, whether it's to build a clean energy plant, a hydrogen plant, where they choose to make their investments, their boards of directors are generally asking three questions. Is this project, is this activity, is it going to produce enough revenue to cover the cost of capital? Is it going to cover the cost of financing and operating costs?
Thank you, Ms. Savage.
Savage. For 5 minutes, Mrs. Midima, and the only witness that we have so far is Mrs. Savage.
Are we able to, or do we know if the other witnesses are returning?
I've written to them and asked them to return, but I have not yet received a reply.
Okay, and are you ready? Sure. I'm going to pass my time to Mr. Fanjoy, thank you.
Ms. Savage, hi. Thank you for sticking with us. I'd like to get your perspective on climate competitiveness and how we strike as a nation at all levels of government, how we strike the balance so that as we address the climate crisis, we do so in a way that also maintains and enhances our ability to thrive as an economy.
Well, thank you. In my opening remarks, I am encouraged by some of the more recent dialogue on backing away from hard, rigid emissions targets to looking at results and looking at climate competitiveness. And I think I look at one policy that has worked and is working to both reduce emissions and attract investment is the industrial carbon pricing. And I believe it's effective at doing both. And I just look at how people say, well, how does it attract investment? But investment decisions for many projects, and I work on a lot of projects in the clean and the energy transition space, a lot of those decisions hinge on being able to create revenue. And revenue can be created by selling carbon credits that a project generates. And so the economics of a lot of these projects are not there without having a price on carbon. And the carbon credits are the one thing that can make some of these projects work. So if it's priced properly, and by priced properly, I mean it's not so high that you see carbon leakage and it's not so low that it's ineffective. So if it's priced properly and if it's left for the provinces to implement, and I say the provinces implementing because they're closer to the industries. They regulate those industries already. They know them extensively. It can work very well. But I think, and it also, if our carbon markets are performing properly, we don't need to layer other regulations on top. We don't need an emissions cap. The tier system in Alberta can bring down the emissions in oil and gas. The tier system in Alberta can bring down emissions in power generation. So I think that's one tool that can be effective at climate competitiveness.
Okay, thank you. We've heard earlier today that Alberta and Saskatchewan are emitting higher than we need them to be as a nation to reach our targets. We understand why. Is that you said that if the industrial carbon price is too low, it won't be effective. Does that indicate that the industrial carbon price is currently too low?
Well, I think that the TIER program, which is Alberta's industrial carbon price, has been in place since 2007. It's on its third reiteration, and it gets tweaked and it gets reset, and the targets and the stringency gets changed from time to time. But I think the concern, and I think you're referring to the freeze in carbon pricing under the TIER program at 95. I think there was concern that jumping up to 170 by 2030 is going too far too fast, and it was creating some concerns with competitiveness. Now, 95 is a lot higher than where it was a few years ago, and it's finding that right sweet spot where you can be effective at reducing emissions and not frightening away investment. But I think there's an opportunity, and back to your climate competitiveness question, for the provinces to be better collaboration. We're not going to get this right on either reducing emissions or attracting investment. We're getting none of it right if we don't have collaboration between the provinces and the federal government.
Okay, thank you. No further questions.
Thank you, Mr. Fanjoy. And now the floor is to Mr. Ross for 5 minutes.
Welcome back, Mr. Swampy. And the word reconciliation is thrown around the House of Commons on a regular basis. And yet you stated Liberal Prime Minister Trudeau refused to meet with a national coalition of chiefs. What needs to change at the federal government level to achieve economic reconciliation? Oh, you're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
There you go.
Sorry about that. No, I mean, what has to happen is that they have to even the playing field. I think one of the biggest problems we had when Trudeau was in power in the National Coalition of Chiefs and the Aboriginal Equity Partners that had a coalition of 31 leaders signed on as owners of Northern Gateway was that he refused to meet with us. He even announced when he canceled the project that he had never spoken with a community member, Indigenous community member that was in support of the project. Of course he didn't, because he wouldn't meet with us. And this is the kind of extractive political institution that we become in this country. We don't listen to both sides of the stories. I tell First Nation leaders that they have to listen to the proponents. You can't let the environmentalists tell you not to meet with us, because once you meet with them, you start to realize these are Canadians. These are Canadian engineers, Canadian technicians, Canadian scientists who are there to protect the environment. They want to protect the environment just as much as First Nation people. And with the amount of resources, the amount of money and time that they've committed to integrity systems, safety systems, environmental protection plans, they'll understand and appreciate it and be confident and provide security for them to ensure that their community is going to be protected against any environmental damage. So that's what the reconciliation is all about, is being involved and getting extra consideration for the Indigenous communities to be able to come on board and be included in these projects. And the First Nations have to act in the same way that an inclusive political institution acts, and that is to hear both sides of the stories, because we elect them to become informed. And if they're refusing to become informed on both sides, they're refusing to make an informed decisions. And that's what's happening right now in Canadian politics, is we're so polarized that we're not, many people are not listening to their side of the story.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Savage, just briefly, you mentioned some of the massive amounts of investment that have fled this country and under the fact that projects simply cannot get built in this country. Is the development of the Major Projects Office not just an admonishment of the system that consecutive Liberal governments have set up in this country, in which projects simply cannot get built and it's easier to put your money in a different country?
Well, I think Bill 5, the Building Canada Act, gives like a workaround, like a complete workaround some of the laws that have inhibited investment, potential workaround the tanker ban, the emissions cap, all of the things that industry is saying holds back investment. So I think that's an acknowledgement that we have a problem in Canada and we can't build things.
Do you think the workaround will work? Or would it be better to repeal all of those Trudeau, Guilbeault, Liberal-era piece of legislation?
Ultimately, a lot of that needs to be repealed. That's going to take some time. It's repealing legislation does take some time, especially if you have to consult with Indigenous groups on some of it. But it's the workaround is an acknowledgement that legislation doesn't work. Bill C-69 in particular needs some significant rewrites, and it's an acknowledgement it needs to be done over time, and we're not going to attract the investment long-term if we keep those laws in place.
Particularly Bill C-69, given the constitutionality question of that. Could you expand a little bit on the challenge that poses from an investment perspective?
Well, I mean, Bill C-69, it's been declared unconstitutional. There's been a rewrite. Most lawyers think it's still going to be found unconstitutional. It's being challenged again. Some of the tests that are in Bill C-69, I think they're in Section 22, have climate tests, sustainability tests, tests that cost a lot of money and a lot of uncertainty for companies to try to invest when you don't know what the outcome is. There's political decisions throughout the legislation which create uncertainty. Project proponents want to know that you're not going to have political interference midstream in a project approval, or worse yet, at the very end after you get through an approval. So there's significant changes that have to happen in Bill C-69 in the long run.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Savage, and this puts an end to our today's sequence. I'd like to thank the witnesses for coming today, and you are all excused. The clerk is going to send an email to everybody to explain a bit of the questioning role rounds. There's a difference. So the first round is 6 minutes, and then all the other rounds are 5 minutes. Pour vous, Monsieur Bonnel, deuxième et troisième tour, c'est...
For Mr. Bonnen, the second and third turn will last 2.5 minutes only. He will only have a 6-minute turn during the first go-around. The clerk will send an email to all of you, and that way you will be able to understand the structure of our questioning turns, and there will be no further confusion.
Meeting adjourned.